March 14, 1947, 2:23 a.m. Dr. Harold Whitmore's eyes flew open. For a split second, he didn't know why. There was no dream, no noise, no obvious reason, just a sudden, instinctive certainty that something was terribly wrong. His heart was already racing before his mind caught up. He tried to lift his right arm. Nothing happened. A sharp pulse of panic shot through him. He tried again, harder this time. Still nothing. His left arm refused to move as well. He attempted to kick, to twist, to roll his body off whatever surface he was lying on. Nothing. That was when the realization hit him fully and completely. He was restrained. Heavy leather straps pinned his wrists, his ankles, his chest. He could feel the cold steel beneath his back, unforgiving and unmoving. His breath came faster now, shallow and uneven, each inhale scraping against his ribs. Then came the smell. It crept into his awareness slowly, unmistakable and deeply familiar. Antiseptic. Iodine. Surgical alcohol. Dr. Whitmore swallowed hard. He knew that smell better than almost any man alive. He was in an operating room. His operating room. The overhead lights blazed down with brutal intensity, flooding his vision with white fire. He blinked rapidly, tears forming at the corners of his eyes as his pupils struggled to adjust. The faint buzzing of the surgical lamps filled the silence, a sound he had heard thousands of times before, usually from the other side of the table. His heart hammered against his chest, each beat louder than the last. He tried to speak, to call out, but his throat felt dry, constricted, useless. Then he saw him. A figure stood in the far corner of the room, half-shadowed, unmoving. The man wore a gray suit, neatly pressed, with a fedora pulled low over his eyes. His arms were crossed casually, as if he were waiting for a train or watching a late-night show. Dr. Whitmore's blood ran cold. He recognized that silhouette instantly. "Bumpy Johnson," he whispered. The name barely left his lips. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. The sound echoed through the room with terrifying clarity. Each step was slow, deliberate, unhurried. "Good morning, Doctor," Bumpy said. His voice was calm. Friendly, even. Whitmore tried to scream. All that came out was a hoarse breath. "You know why you're here," Bumpy continued, stopping at the edge of the operating table. It wasn't a question. 48 hours earlier, Dr. Harold Whitmore had been sitting behind his desk at Presbyterian Hospital, reviewing charts and sipping lukewarm coffee. His office overlooked Manhattan, a view earned through decades of discipline, ambition, and unwavering confidence in his own importance. Whitmore was 54 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He had trained at Harvard Medical School, completed his residency under some of the finest surgeons in the country, and risen steadily through the ranks until he became chief of surgery at one of New York City's most prestigious hospitals. He had operated on senators, on industrial tycoons, on families whose wealth stretched back generations. In 28 years of practice, his hands had saved countless lives. And in those same 28 years, he had never once operated on a black patient. It wasn't something he thought about often. To Whitmore, it wasn't cruelty or hatred, it was simply order. The way the world worked. Certain hospitals served certain people. Certain patients belonged in certain wards. And some didn't belong at all. So when the call came on March 12, 1947, requesting his immediate assistance for a black woman from Harlem suffering from acute appendicitis, Whitmore barely paused. The message reached him through intermediaries, political contacts, hospital administrators, even a discreet offer of payment so generous it bordered on absurd. The woman's appendix was dangerously positioned, they said. Harlem Hospital lacked the specialist skill and equipment needed to save her. Whitmore listened quietly as his secretary relayed the details. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave a small shake of his head. "Send back a reply," he said. "Yes, doctor?" Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry or conflicted. His tone was flat, decisive. "I don't operate on colored patients." 6 words. That was all. Those 6 words passed from mouth to mouth, traveling through the hidden veins of New York City, through nurses, fixers, ward bosses, and political go-betweens, until they reached Harlem. Until they reached Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was sitting in his office above Small's Paradise, the famous nightclub humming below him. The walls were lined with books, poetry, philosophy, history. Bumpy Johnson was not the brute many imagined. He was thoughtful, strategic, precise. Illinois Gordon delivered the message. For a long moment, Bumpy said nothing. He didn't slam his fist on the desk. He didn't curse. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared at a spot on the wall, his face completely still. Then he spoke. "Get me everything on Dr. Harold Whitmore," he said quietly. "Everything. Where he lives. Where he eats. Where he sleeps. I want to know what he loves." Illinois felt a chill run through him. He had heard that tone before. It meant something irreversible had been set in motion. To understand why those 6 words mattered, you need to understand Margaret Moultrie Johnson. She was 67 years old in the spring of 1947. Small in stature, barely 5 feet tall on a good day, with hands worn rough from decades of work. She had spent most of her life in Charleston, South Carolina, raising 7 children under conditions designed to break black families. She survived Jim Crow. She survived poverty. She survived a husband who worked himself into an early grave. Everyone who knew Margaret said the same thing. She was quiet but unbreakable. When her youngest son Ellsworth began getting into trouble as a teenager, too proud, too angry at the way white men treated him, Margaret made a choice that tore her apart. She sent him north to Harlem to live with his sister. It broke her heart. But it saved his life. By 1947, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was no longer just her son. He was the most powerful black man in New York City. He controlled Harlem's numbers racket. He negotiated directly with the Italian mafia. He had influence over police captains, judges, and politicians. When Bumpy entered a room, people noticed. But none of that power mattered to him the way his mother did. 5 years earlier, he had brought Margaret north, setting her up in a brownstone on 139th Street. Every Sunday, no matter what wars were brewing or deals were being made, Bumpy ate dinner at her kitchen table. For those hours, he wasn't Harlem's godfather. He was just Ellsworth. On March 12, 1947, Margaret collapsed in her kitchen. The pain was sudden, sharp, unbearable. Neighbors rushed her to Harlem Hospital, where doctors quickly diagnosed acute appendicitis. Worse still, her appendix was positioned unusually. If it ruptured, the infection would spread rapidly. Without surgery, she would die. The surgeons at Harlem Hospital did what they could, but they knew the truth. This case required a specialist. There were only a handful in New York capable of performing the operation safely. At the top of that list was Dr. Harold Whitmore. And he had refused. By the time Dr. Whitmore woke up strapped to his own operating table, the clock had already been ticking for 48 hours. And Harlem was done waiting. By the time dawn broke over Harlem on March 13, 1947, Bumpy Johnson already knew one truth with absolute certainty. Time was his enemy. His mother lay in a hospital bed with a failing body and a ticking clock inside her. Acute appendicitis was unforgiving. Every hour that passed increased the risk of rupture, infection, death. Harlem Hospital's doctors did what they could: pain management, fluids, monitoring, but they all understood the limits of their power. Without surgery, Margaret Moultrie Johnson would not survive. Bumpy sat at her bedside through the early hours of the morning. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled coffee. The walls were chipped, the equipment outdated. This was what black patients were given in 1947, not because medicine lacked the means, but because society lacked the will. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. When her eyes opened, they always searched for him. Ellsworth, she whispered once, her voice barely audible. You look tired. Bumpy forced a smile and squeezed her hand. I'm all right, Mama. Just rest. She studied his face with the same sharp awareness she had carried her whole life. Don't do nothing foolish on account of me, she said softly. Bumpy leaned closer. I won't, he said. It was not a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. By mid-morning, Bumpy was back in his office above Small's Paradise. The club below throbbed with life even during the day. Music, laughter, the sound of Harlem refusing to bow to the world pressing in around it. Inside the office, the atmosphere was different. Quiet, focused, controlled. Bumpy sat behind his desk while his network came alive. He had built it carefully over years, understanding something most powerful men never grasped. Information didn't belong to the loud or the rich. It belonged to the unnoticed. Shoeshine boys on Wall Street who overheard conversations while polishing expensive shoes. Doormen who saw who came and went from Upper East Side townhouses. Cab drivers who knew patterns better than any map. Cleaning women who heard secrets whispered in private dining rooms. Nurses who noticed schedules no one else paid attention to. Within hours, the name Dr. Harold Whitmore was moving through the city like an electric current. By noon, Bumpy had a complete picture. Whitmore lived on the Upper East Side in a narrow but elegant townhouse with his wife Eleanor and their 2 children. He drove a dark blue 1946 Cadillac Series 62, license plate beginning with a W. He ate lunch every weekday at the same restaurant on Madison Avenue, always ordering the same meal. He had a mistress, a young nurse named Patricia, 26 years old, living alone in a midtown apartment. He visited discreetly every Tuesday and Friday. But none of that was what caught Bumpy's attention. What mattered was Whitmore's private surgical clinic on East 72nd Street. A small, exclusive facility catering to wealthy patients who valued privacy over publicity. State-of-the-art equipment, restricted access, and most importantly, on Wednesday nights Whitmore worked there alone. Reviewing cases, preparing for surgery. No staff, no witnesses. Bumpy folded his hands and stared at the wall. This wasn't rage. This was planning. That afternoon, Bumpy made a different call. Dr. Charles Freeman was 39 years old. Brilliant, calm, quietly frustrated. He had trained under the same surgical philosophies as men like Whitmore. His hands were steady, his mind precise, his results impeccable. But because he was black, hospitals denied him opportunities at every turn. He assisted. He observed. He waited. Bumpy's men found him at home. When Freeman arrived at Bumpy's office, he looked uncomfortable. He had heard the rumors. Everyone in Harlem knew who Bumpy Johnson was. And everyone knew that when Bumpy asked for something, saying no wasn't really an option. You're going to save my mother's life, Bumpy said plainly. Freeman swallowed. Mr. Johnson, You're qualified, Bumpy interrupted. More than qualified. Yes, Freeman said carefully. But I don't have access to the equipment required. No hospital in this city will give me an operating room for a case like this. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. By tomorrow night, he said, you'll have access to the best surgical clinic on the Upper East Side. The best equipment in New York. Nurses who won't ask questions. Freeman hesitated. How? Bumpy smiled faintly. That's my problem. Freeman didn't ask anything else. Something in Bumpy's eyes told him the answers wouldn't help him sleep. As evening approached, Bumpy gathered 4 men he trusted completely. Men who had survived wars with Dutch Schultz. Men who knew how to disappear. Men who followed instructions precisely, and asked questions later, if at all. Roosevelt was the biggest among them. A mountain of a man with hands like concrete blocks. He frowned when Bumpy finished outlining the plan. What are we doing with the doctor? Roosevelt asked. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He told my mother she wasn't good enough for his operating room, Bumpy said finally. Tonight, I'm going to show him what it feels like to lie on that table with no power. No choice. And then, another man asked. Bumpy's voice hardened. Then I take something from him that he can never get back. No one spoke after that. Wednesday night came fast. Too fast. At Harlem Hospital, Margaret's condition worsened. Her pain increased. Her fever rose. The doctors exchanged looks they didn't want Bumpy to see. Time was nearly gone. At 8:47 p.m., Dr. Harold Whitmore locked the doors of his private clinic on East 72nd Street. He was tired, irritated, eager to get home. He walked toward his Cadillac in the small lot behind the building, keys in hand. He never heard the footsteps behind him. A cloth bag dropped over his head. Strong hands grabbed his arms. A needle pierced his neck. The world vanished. At the same time, two vehicles moved quietly through Harlem Street. Margaret Moultrie Johnson was transported carefully from Harlem Hospital. Two nurses, women loyal to Bumpy and sworn to silence, rode with her. She was sedated, stable, and still alive. Barely. At the East 72nd Street Clinic, lights flickered on in a secondary operating room. Dr. Charles Freeman stood at the sink, scrubbing his hands. The equipment gleamed under the surgical lights, modern, immaculate, untouched by any black patient before this night. He took a deep breath. This was what he had trained for. This was what he had been denied. This was his chance. "Let's begin," he said. 4 hours later, Dr. Harold Whitmore woke up. Strapped down. Blinded by lights. His own operating room turned against him. And standing over him was the man whose name he should have taken seriously when he had the chance. "Good morning, Doctor," Bumpy Johnson said calmly. Whitmore's breath hitched. "You know why you're here." And somewhere else in the same building, steel met flesh as Dr. Charles Freeman began the operation that would decide who lived and who paid.